Hello, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And special Mindfields today. Mindfields, my way of kind of expressing what's been on my mind lately and trying to focus in such a way is helpful to shed some light on what's really going on in the world and what my father's story really is, unveiling as much of the hidden past as we can to help the future have a more realistic view on what's happened in my lifetime and to be able to fix it because there's a whole lot wrong with this world. And a lot of it started in 1946, 47, 48 with the creation of our National Security Council, the CIA, and the related institutions that we talk about so much here on McDuff Lives. Now, most of you are probably familiar with Mike Benz. He is a conservative commentator, a very prolific um, um, speaker, and he made a very important speech recently at Hillsdale College, and it's titled "The Beginnings of the National Security State." And wow, the idea that somebody's saying we have a national security state, and a state being an independent country, right? Um, Makes a lot of sense given the evidence, but how can we really prove that it exists? And once we can find out, how it exists, can we then make a reasonable judgment as a nation as to whether it's in our best interest to continue it and then find a way to extract ourselves if that's even possible? Now, all of that should sound familiar to people who are fans of McDuff and the history of his career with the government, because obviously that was what his job was at the institution called SACSA, SACSA, which was created by President Kennedy to take special operations, what we'll be talking about today, away from the CIA following the Bay of Pigs. So, what I want to do first is just a little show and tell. If you may have seen this before, but I want to make sure that everybody's aware of the fact that they've been trying to cover up the existence of Saxa for decades. And I just am going to put this right in front of the camera so you can see it. This here is a Saxa mug. It says Saxa on it. And on the back of it, it has my father's name, Thomas F. O'Loughlin. So I hope you get interested in finding out, more details about Saxa. And in fact, I think I am considering doing a little historical series on how Saxa came to be and then how it was during my dad's lifetime and what happened after it. It's something that I don't think anyone else has done because so far, I think they've really tried to steer everybody away from studying Saxa. But it's the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities. Now, my father was in the U.S. Navy, served on the USS Nashville, as you know, 22 months, went to law school, joined the FBI, and became one of Hoover's top FBI assistants. And in the context of what he knew in the world, one thing that I don't think that he would have known because it was all kept secret was this doctrine of plausible deniability. And this in National Security Council uh, Memorandum 10/2. Now that was passed in 1948, but it wasn't revealed to the public until 2010. So now let's let Mike Benz tell us the details, what I think are so very, very important. And indulge me as I get the video set up. This is Mike Benz's X page. I recommend you follow him there. He's been on fire for quite some time, and this is where I am going to pick up his speech at Hillsdale College from just a few days ago and let him take over as we listen to things that basically cause my jaw to drop when he um, goes through it. So let's go.
So I want to just go through this since I didn't see a hand raised in this room. This key document that was the predecessor to the government linchpin license that created this whole universe. So we're just going to go through some of these receipts I've flagged on screen here. This is from George Kennan, April 30th, 1948, just the week before the Central Intelligence Agency had achieved this incredible win in Italy. And George Kennan and the State Department and the White House were so overwhelmed with delight about the world of possibility if we could simply scale the Italian operation. But the problem is it was very much against everything this country had stood for a century and a half before that. So I'm just going to read some of the highlighted items here. So you'll see the phrase political warfare dots this in a very deliberate way: organized political warfare by the US government to further our national objectives, to further our influence and authority, using means both overt and covert, including black psychological warfare and many other techniques. George Kennan says here, we have been handicapped, however, by a popular attachment to the concept of a basic difference between peace and war. And that our public, you'll see he actually crossed out of the draft, because again, this is a top secret memo that was published in 1948 and wasn't declassified until 2005. The hard record preserves his own scrawls. You'll see at the bottom it says, we're hamstrung by this basic difference between peace and war, by our public's yearnings, and then that's crossed out and it says, by a national tendency to seek a political cure-all and a reluctance to recognize the realities of international relations. Basically saying, listen, we answer to the voters, the people, and they're not going to like this. They don't understand international relations. They think there's a difference between peace and war, and World War II is over. It just ended 3 years ago. But if we go into peacetime mode and we do not continue political warfare, then we will lose the opportunity to dominate the 20th century. And you'll see here it references this was the Italian elections, right? That we just engaged in this in the Italian elections 12 days from then, and that this political warfare has to be directed and coordinated by the Department of State. And we're going to come back to that because when you see the shape of the intelligence state, it extends far beyond intelligence and actually it's really a tool of statecraft. So here is a very interesting, telling vision into this CIA godfather. It says, we cannot afford in the future, in perhaps more serious political crises, to scramble into impromptu covert operations as we did at the time of the Italian elections. Saying, we did this, it was great, it was amazing, but we need this capacity everywhere. We need it on every country on earth where there might be a political crisis, every country on earth where there might be a need for us to protect US national interests or trade interests or financial interests or security interests. We need the same network we had in Italy, working with everyone from the cultural influencers to the media, to the churches, to the charities, to the organized crime networks, even if we don't use it, just in case we need it, so we don't need to scramble if an opposition politician decides to go sideways against a US national interest agenda. So I'm setting the stage with that before we go back in time and then sort of go through the whole history of this, because just less than 2 months after George Kennan wrote that inauguration of organized political warfare, saying, since 1789, we have never done this sort of thing in any organized fashion. The American people aren't going to like it, but we have to do it. Just less than 2 months after that, George Kennan then sponsored the very act which would permanently change the structure of the American government and the way our country works. And this was the National Security Council Memo 10-2. Now, for folks who are not familiar, the National Security Council is called the interagency. It coordinates what the State Department, the Defense Department, the CIA, what everyone is doing, so that they are all working in a complementary fashion. It's in the White House, and it's sort of the executive oversight of everything. So You'll see this memo here, NSC 10-2, and just so that you see it, it's right here on the State Department website under state.gov, what I'm about to read here. It sanctioned U.S. intelligence to carry out a broad range of covert operations, including propaganda, economic warfare, demolition, subversion, sabotage. It was sponsored by George Kennan. He was the one who pushed for this right after he wrote The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare. But he would later say it was the greatest mistake he ever made because of the monster it created. Because what NSC 10-2 did was it gave the intelligence community, this burgeoning, newly created CIA, and we now have 17 intelligence agencies plus the ODNI. They transformed not just from spy organizations, but to lie organizations. And what I mean by that is because of this phrase that is used in NSC 10-2. I'm going to read it. All of these activities, which are normally illegal, can be carried out so long as they are planned and executed so that any U.S. government responsibility for them is not evident to unauthorized persons, and that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly deny any responsibility for them. I'm going to actually just show you the exact language here. This is, again, 1948. All covert operations, all of these, sabotage, demolition, controlling the media, they are now legal as long as they are planned and executed so that any U.S. government responsibility is not evident to unauthorized persons. So you are cast out of Eden, effectively, if you eat the apple of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. You are not allowed to know, and they are not allowed to tell you. Their job is to lie to you. And that if they do get caught, the U.S. government can then lie above the agency level, above the CIA. The State Department gets to lie to the world because the CIA had these covert links, and they can say it was not an official sanctioned U.S. government operation. Something went rogue, someone wasn't authorized, someone took it into their own hands. And I'm just going to read this analysis that I think is a useful summary. That plausible deniability encouraged the autonomy of this newly created CIA, which was just created the year earlier, and other covert action agencies in order to protect the visible authorities of the government. And we're going to come back to that as we discuss the power structure of all these different organizations. But I want to drive this point home immediately, which is that this was seen as a major growth opportunity because of how effective it was in the 1940s and the 1950s to be able to take over the world through diplomacy, through duplicity. But the problem with diplomacy through duplicity, plausible deniability, is the core doctrine that governs the interagency which controls all of our major U.S. government operations on national security, foreign policy, and international interests. Because you lie to the outside world, you need to also lie to your own citizens to keep the outside from finding out. So while the lies may help you successfully acquire an empire, you now have to permanently maintain an empire of lies, not just abroad, but at home. Okay. Now, in 1948, when the founding fathers of the intelligence state were setting this all up, they were intensely aware of the monster they were making. And in 1948, Congress passed the Smith-Mundt Act, because again, in 1948 is when all this was getting established. The CIA was brand new. NSC 10-2 had just come out. And Congress said, okay, listen, you guys are creating a monster here. We want to make sure that we don't build this empire of lies and that Americans are not being inundated with this sprawl of information control that you are conducting around the world in order to conduct organized political warfare on all countries on planet Earth. And I think many folks in this room are probably familiar with what happened during the Obama administration, which was this essential safeguard, which had been with us since the moment this all was created in 1948, was repealed with quite little fanfare. It was tucked into an NDAA. It was really, I think, only discovered by the public after the damage had been done, that the Smith-Mundt was modernized to get rid of that restriction. It was effectively amended. And so the headline here is U.S. repeals propaganda ban, spreads government made news to Americans. For decades, this anti-propaganda law prevented the U.S. government's mammoth broadcasting arm, I should say arms, from delivering programming to American audiences. And mammoth is not a big enough word. After World War II, the world, actually at this exact time in 1948, the UN Declaration for Human Rights came out and forbade the territorial acquisition of other countries by military force. It became against these new international norms and standards, international law. You could not simply have a military occupation of the Philippines like the United States had in the early 1900s. And so, with hard power ruled out as the dominant means to have an empire, the US transitioned to a soft power empire, which would be dominated by agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency, democracy promotion programs at the State Department, later USAID, and the whole swarm army we're about to meet. But even right out the gate, the Central Intelligence Agency immediately moved into the media space to control the messaging that people around the world experienced. And so I have on screen Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, dozens of others. They were CIA proprietary media. This is Frank Wisner. Frank Wisner was the spearhead of this early CIA media control apparatus. The name comes from the Wurlitzer sort of piano-like organ, because Wisner would brag that he could play in the international news as if it was a Wurlitzer. He could have any narrative carried in any country on earth because of the vast sprawl of media control that this newly formed intelligence agency, which was leveraging essentially the Office of War Information's Pentagon media network created during World War II, to thousands of partnered media outlets on all 6 populated continents. At that time, 1/3 of CIA's budget went just to funding media organizations. And today that number is paralleled by the web of CIA cutouts that we'll meet when we get to 1983 and beyond, and how this initial structure changed after the scandals of the 1970s. This was popularly
And forgive me for that little glitch, but yeah, essentially play God all around the world. Well, thank you, Mike Benz, for that. And the entire speech is 41 minutes. I've watched it twice. I recommend you watch it twice too, because you'll start getting a new perspective on what's really the big problem here. And the big problem here is the national security state. Now, going back just to cover a couple of things, let's remember that after the death of President Roosevelt, Harry Truman, who had just become the vice president, becomes the president. And he wins against all odds against the Republican candidate, Thomas Dewey of New York, who was really an insider with Allen Dulles and the whole, kind of, oh, let's just say fascist friendly New York crowd that, centers around Sullivan and Cromwell and the oil companies and the big firms that they represent and the financiers of Wall Street. And so George Kennan, he comes from Kuhn and Loeb to the State Department. And you can see that by this time, the State Department is already basically running its own show. And the idea, though, that the American people would allow us to do things like subvert foreign democracies, install dictators, pay for people's torture, the assassination of people like Patrice Lumumba and so many other people. The idea that we would actually be in favor of that or support it in our country is just, it was just shocking then, and it should be shocking now, except for now the truth is coming out. So who is it that's letting this stuff happen. Well, once they put it in the form of law, then it becomes very hard to fight against it, to object against it. But what we have here is actually much worse, and that is a secret law. The National Security uh, Memorandum, National Security Council Memorandum 10/2, was kept secret until 2010. Now, how did this all get enacted into law in 1948? Well, listen to the first part of Mike Benz's speech to get more oriented to that. But it is a situation where the OSS has been running dirty tricks as well as good stuff, but dirty tricks. They then find the war is over, but the State Department has opportunities. And so they create this Office of Policy Coordination and then slip it into the State Department. And in the State Department, which has been happily running our foreign policy, now has the key to doing things like covert operations that they never had before, because of the existence of the OSS and the networks and the possibilities that were created during World War II for what Mike Benz calls political warfare. And so, and what George Kennan called political warfare in the essay that he wrote, that was also, I'm sure, kept secret until, right before the publication of NSC 10/2. This happened in the Truman administration. Now, I thought Truman, as a Democrat, would be opposed to Allen Dulles and the Dulles, Wall Street security state. But what happens is he falls under the influence of an Averell Harriman and the security state side of the Democratic Party. And it's like, you can see, if you look back, what we call the uniparty being, in essence, already there, perhaps not recognizing that they're working together because they're enemies, but, and then along comes a Scoop Jackson later. But the idea that, wow, the Democrats are the ones that put us in this fix. It wasn't the Republicans that did it. Now, the Republicans certainly, once they got the power in 1952 with the Eisenhower administration, then in come the Dulleses, and that's exactly what happened, and that is exactly why we are in such a mess today with our government apparently running amok, and to the extent that it is the great Satan in the world to a whole, billions and billions of people. And why shouldn't it look like the great Satan in the world when you have these horrible things going on? And what for? What is the political warfare intended to do? It is intended to serve the needs of the clients of the State Department, which was run by John Foster Dulles, the senior partner of Sullivan and Cromwell, and Alan Welsh Dulles, his brother, the director of Central Intelligence. They are working and Benz does a great job of showing that the State Department all along had within every embassy some program to monitor local elections, or to keep into the drawing rooms of the royalty, or to be connected to every country in such a way as to be able to warn the State Department, hey, there's a shift of government coming that you might not like. Maybe something like nationalizing an industry, for instance, which obviously is part of our history. And so the wheels start rolling in the State Department to create special operations in order to change the outcome of that election. And what Mike Benz does so well is to just set out what we many of us have studied the Italian elections of 1946, and it's all over the history books, Operation Gladio, and how we um, just manipulated the election by bribing people, by assassination squads, by hiring people like uh, uh, um, Junio Borghese, the Black Prince, and people to run really fascist terrorist organizations, as well as bribing and the church and other social institutions, as Mike Benz mentions in his speech we just listened to. And somehow they found $250 million, which was left over from the OSS's war chest, and they just threw it at the Italian elections. And then when their illegal activities became the reason that Italy was, quote, saved from the commies, then that became the model that was accepted. Because, I mean, this is after, our lawmakers have seen the Italian election. And this is the executive branch, the State Department, and the president and the Defense Department getting together and saying, we need this covert operations thing to be on the shelf for whenever we need it. Well, Harry Truman seems to have been a pretty easily played character. I mean, you hear about him as this, he worked as a haberdasher. He played the piano, and he was connected with the Kansas City outfit. I mean, the political, what was Pendergrass, I think was his name. So he was kind of like a get along, go along guy. And, he becomes the president of the United States, after, just because he was the vice president. We see that going on a little bit today, don't we? And so is he not now being manipulated? Because look at what we talked about in the most recent Mindfields. It was just 2 days ago, where we talked about how the Schofield Bible, 1908, 1909, becomes the Bible of many, many of the fundamentalist Christian churches, denominations, and becomes the most popular Bible in the United States, with millions and millions of people reading it and studying it and getting their idea of what the Bible is about and what the Bible requires for our future happiness from this Schofield Bible, which is full of commentaries that are um, knitted together into a narrative that wasn't apparent to people who just read the Bible up until this time. But it's clear that he was being financed and supported by a clique of New Yorkers, including Samuel Untermeyer, the famous Jewish Zionist of the first half of the 20th century. So Hoover, I'm sorry, but so Harry Truman grows up, becomes a Mason, which is also friendly to this idea, especially at the top of Freemasonry, and I think he was 33rd degree. But he becomes partners with a Jewish merchant in the haberdashery business, and this Jewish merchant and he become friends, and he starts thinking, I like Jews. Jews are not so bad. And so by the time he has absorbed his view of Christianity, the effect of the Schofield Bible has been magnified by others. Billy Graham, always ready to whisper in the president's ear. And so you end up with a support system around the president that's going to allow him to do something that nobody wanted him to do, which was to sign off on the recognition of the state of Israel. So again, you have here in the White House somebody who really doesn't know anything about foreign policy, who doesn't know anything about the history of the United States covert operations, the State Department's various machinations over the years, and the FBI and all the rest of the intelligence community is pretty opaque to this guy. So he in other words, I think that the passage of National Security Council 10/2 under the administration of Harry Truman was very similar to his being persuaded to sign off on the creation of Israel and its recognition as a state that then benefits from what Mike Benz just explained to us about how we entered into a UN uh, era in which we no longer can conquer land by force of arms, but now have to respect national boundaries, and therefore our power is turned to soft power. Soft power includes all of these nasty special operations that we have uh, ostensibly approved of in NSC 10/2. Pardon me a second. And of course, where it leads to when you get to the last part of Mr. Benz's presentation that I shared was that not only do they have to lie to the rest of the world, they also have to lie to the American people. And so in the Obama administration, they actually got rid of the Smith-Mundt rule, which said that the government cannot use media to project propaganda at the American people. So now, we're over the water's over the dam. We have already reached that point where our government will lie to us in order to protect the secret operations that are going on per 10/2 that have nothing to do with what the American people want, but it's all about serving the needs of this national security state, which I think Mike Benz terms the blob, and I like that. And it's a combination of the Pentagon, the State Department, the CIA, and a number of agencies that are CIA cutouts, like USAID, which is so ubiquitous and always there when regime change is going on. And this cynical application of soft power internet connection is okay. Apologies for that. Now we're back. Okay, great. All right, and hello everybody. I just saying hi to you over at the chat room. Thanks for joining me. I'm broadcasting on all of my channels this morning because I think Mike Benz's presentation is so darn important. Well, I want to read something else to you now, if you don't mind. This is from the State Department Office of the Historian. And this document is entitled Note on Covert Actions. And I'm going to share the screen, so if you want, you can study it later. But you can find all kinds of interesting things at the Office of the Historian of the Secretary of State, the Department of State. So this one here is called Note on U.S. Covert Actions, and I'm just going to read it. Let's go down to here. Well, management of covert actions in the Truman presidency. The Truman administration's concern over Soviet psychological warfare prompted the new National Security Council to authorize an NSC-4A of December of 1947, the launching of peacetime covert action operations. So there's where it all begins, right there, NSC-4A. Again, this is Truman. NSC-4A made the Director of Central Intelligence responsible for psychological warfare, establishing at the same time the principle that covert action was an exclusively executive branch function. The Central Intelligence Agency certainly was a natural choice, but it was assigned this function at least in part because the agency controlled unvouchered funds by which operations could be funded with minimal risk of exposure in Washington. CIA's early use of its new covert action mandate dissatisfied officials at the Departments of State and Defense. The Department of State, believing this role too important to be left to the CIA alone and concerned that the military might create a new rival covert action office in the Pentagon. Underline that, okay, because that's what SACSA was. Pressed to reopen the issue of where responsibility for covert action activities should reside. Consequently, on June 18, 1948, NSC 10/2 superseded NSC 4A. NSC 10/2 directed CIA to conduct, quote, covert, unquote, rather than merely psychological operations, defining them as all activities which are conducted or sponsored by this government against hostile foreign states or groups, or in support of friendly foreign states or groups, but which are so planned and executed that any U.S. government responsibility for them is not evident to unauthorized persons, and that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly disclaim any responsibility for them. The type of clandestine activities enumerated under the new directive included, quote, propaganda, economic warfare, preventive direct action, including sabotage, demolition, and evacuation measures, subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance movements, guerrillas, and refugee liberations groups, and support of indigenous anti-communist elements in threatened countries of the free world. Such operations should not include armed conflict by recognized military forces, espionage, counterespionage, and cover and deception for military operations. The Office of Policy Coordination, and again, this becomes Frank Wisner, and we've learned a lot about Frank Wisner recently when we read from John Loftus's book, The Secret War Against the Jews. The Office of Policy Coordination, newly established in the CIA on September 1948, in accordance with NSC 10/2, assumed responsibility for organizing and managing covert actions. OPC, which was to take its guidance from the Department of State in peacetime and from the military in wartime, initially had direct access to the State Department and to the military without having to proceed through CIA's administrative hierarchy. This is before Allen Dulles, so it's Allen Dulles' hierarchy that they didn't have at the time. Provided the DCI was informed of all important projects and decisions. In 1950, this arrangement was modified to ensure that the policy guidance came to OPC through the DCI. During the Korean conflict, the OPC grew quickly. Wartime commitments and other missions soon made covert action the most expensive and bureaucratically prominent of CIA's activities. Again, this is Dulles' dream come true. Allen Dulles. Concerned about the situation, DCI Walter Bedell Smith in early 1951 asked the NSC for enhanced policy guidance. The White House responded with two initiatives. President Truman created the Psychological Strategy Board under the NSC to coordinate government-wide psychological warfare strategy, NSC 10/5 in 1951 reaffirmed the covert action mandate given in 10/2 and expanded the CIA's authority over guerrilla warfare. The PSB was soon abolished by the incoming Eisenhower administration, but the expansion of CIA's covert action writ in NSC 10/5 helped ensure that covert action would remain a major function of the agency. As the Truman administration ended, CIA was near the peak of its independence and authority in the field of covert action. Although CIA continued to seek and receive advice on special projects from the NSC, the PSB and the departmental representatives originally delegated to advise OPC. No group or officer outside of the DCI and the president himself had authority to order, approve, manage, or curtail operations. So it's only now that we see, as a result of 10/2 and 10/5, that Allen Dulles at the top of the CIA becomes completely independent of any supervision, except for unless the president wants to make a change. But we all know that Eisenhower, while he probably knew a lot more than he lets on that he knew, was content to let Allen Dulles run things during his presidency. And that is how we got to the Bay of Pigs. NSC 5412, the special group. The Eisenhower administration began narrowing CIA's latitude in 1954 in accordance with a series of NSC directives. The responsibility of the DCI for the conduct of covert operations was further clarified. President Eisenhower approved NSC 5412, reaffirming the CIA's responsibility for conducting covert actions abroad. A definition of covert action was set forth. The DCI was made responsible for coordinating with the designated representatives of the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense to ensure that covert operations were planned and conducted in a manner consistent with U.S. foreign and military policies. And the Operations Coordinating Board was designated the normal channel for coordinating support for covert operations. The president was to be advised in advance of major covert operation programs initiated by the CIA under this policy, and was to give policy approval for such programs and secure coordination of support among the departments of state and defense. A year later, the NSC 5412/1 was issued identical to the previous one, except for designating the Planning Coordinating Group as the body responsible for coordinating covert operations. NSC 5412/2 creates what is called the Special Group. NSC 5412/2 Special Group emerged as the executive body to review and approve covert action programs initiated by the CIA. The membership of this special group varied depending upon the situation faced. Meetings were infrequent until 1959, when weekly meetings began to be held. Neither the CIA nor the special group adopted fixed criteria for bringing projects before the group. Initiative remained with the CIA, as members representing other agencies frequently were unable to judge the feasibility of particular projects. All right, now we're getting toward the end of this little essay, and I want to once again refer you back to McDuff's story, where he's taken or drafted from the FBI to become part of President Kennedy's new operation called SAXA to take all these special operations away from the CIA. And right after he fired, you know who, Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell, and Charles Cabell. So, and this is right deadly straight into my dad's career. Here we go. After the Bay of Pigs failure in April 1961, General Maxwell Taylor reviewed U.S. paramilitary capabilities at President Kennedy's request and submitted a report in June, which recommended strengthening high-level direction of covert operations. As a result of the Taylor Report, the special group, chaired by the President's Special Assistant for National Security Affairs, McGeorge Bundy, and including Deputy Secretary of State U. Alexis Johnson, Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Kilpatrick, Director of Central Intelligence Alan Dulles, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Lyman Lemnitzer, assumed greater responsibility for planning and reviewing covert operations. Until 1963, the DCI determined whether a CIA-originated project was submitted to the special group. In 1963, the special group developed general but informal criteria, including risk, possibility of success, potential for exposure, political sensitivity, and cost, for determining whether covert action projects were submitted to the special group. From November 1961 to October 1962, a special group augmented, whose membership was the same as the special group, plus Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and General Maxwell Taylor as chairman, exercised responsibility for Operation Mongoose, a major covert operation aimed at overthrowing the Castro regime in Cuba. When President Kennedy authorized the program in November, he designated Brigadier General Edward G. Lansdale, Assistant for Special Operations to the Secretary of Defense, to act as Chief of Operations, and Lansdale coordinated the Mongoose activities among the CIA and the Departments of State and Defense. CIA units in Washington and Miami had primary responsibility for implementing Mongoose operations, which included military, sabotage, and political propaganda programs. President Kennedy also established a special group counterinsurgency, the Special Group CI, on January 18, 1962, when he signed NSAM number 124. Now remember, this is January 1962, and it is in February of 1962 that my dad is drafted into this new organization in the Joint Chiefs of Staff called SACSA, comes into being with the mission from the president to take over the special operations from the CIA. The Special Group CI, set up to coordinate counterinsurgency activities separate from the mechanism for implementing NSC 5412-2, was to confine itself to establishing broad policies aimed at preventing and resisting subversive insurgency and other forms of indirect aggression in friendly countries. In early 1966, in NSAM 341, President Johnson assigned responsibility for the direction and coordination of counterinsurgency activities overseas to the Secretary of State, who established a senior interdepartmental group, SIG, to assist in discharging these responsibilities. NSAM number 303, June the 2nd, 1964, from Bundy to the Secretary of State and Defense and the DCI, changed the name of Special Group 5412 to the 303 Committee, but did not alter its composition, functions, or responsibility. Bundy was the chairman. The special group approved 163 covert actions during the Kennedy administration and 142 during the Johnson administration through 1967. The 1976 final report of the Church Committee, however, estimated that several thousand projects undertaken by the CIA since 1961, only 14% were considered on a case-by-case basis by the 303 Committee and its predecessors. Those not reviewed by the 303 Committee were low-risk and low-cost operations. We're sure of that, right? The final report also cited a February 1967 CIA memorandum that included a description of the mode of policy arbitration of decisions on covert actions within the 303 system. Well, what stands out as I read this is the State Department is writing a history of special operations and counterinsurgency with their own CI counterinsurgency group, the special group. All of these people are making the decisions that President Kennedy assigned to SACSA, to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and which was the reason that SACSA was created, to take this stuff away from the State Department and thereby from the CIA. So President Kennedy passed a national security memorandum, which was one of the first things that I learned when I started studying this almost 10 years ago from Fletcher Prouty. And that is that he said to the Joints of Chief in his memorandum, Joint Chiefs of Staff, it's NSAM, NSSM, NSAM, and I can't remember the number, but it's a very famous one. He sent this memorandum to the Joint Chiefs and said, "You are now my chief advisors in peacetime as well as in wartime." And with that, he took away the supremacy of the DCI, of the Director of Central Intelligence, that had been set up in 1948, and gave it to the Joint Chiefs, who operated it through SACSA, which is the outfit that my dad worked for 10 years, right up to his untimely death. So what I would say now is, let's not leave SACSA out when we're uncovering the truth about the past, the lies that have been told to the world and to the American people, and to honor people who tried against this unknown tide of secret plausible deniability to swim against that tide and to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And the last word I would have on this subject right now is what Mike Benz pointed out at the early part of his presentation there, that George Kennan was operating on behalf of the commercial interests of Wall Street that are so tied to the commercial interests of London and other European financial centers, that he was willing to give away the essential qualities of being an American. And that's what we couldn't accept. That's why he had to keep it all hidden. And that's why all of the people from Alan Dulles to Mike Pompeo have been operating under a license to lie, cheat, steal, rape, torture, assassinate since 1948. And as Mike goes on in his presentation to show how now these career paths exist, that hey, how am I going to get my kids through school if we don't continue doing these operations that are just part of the fabric of American foreign policy? What are we going to do with all the people? Same problem that happened in 1946 when the OSS was disbanded. Where are these guys going to go? And they will find a place to continue doing what they're doing. I am very grateful to Mike Benz for all of the stuff that he's put out here, but let's not let it just be a Band-Aid over a horrible, horrible infection that still lingers and turns cancerous and is killing us as the nation we are supposed to be. When I think about the military and how they did not want to get involved in special operations, they thought, well, no, that's not us. Why is that? because of three things: duty, honor, country. You can't be an American without honor. And that's what George Kennan did to America. He took away our honor. And thanks for being with me today. I appreciate it. It's been very personal to me, but I am just absolutely grateful to Mike Benz for what he's revealed, and can't wait to learn more. Have a great day, everybody.